Thank you everyone for attending this session, and thanks Bill for stepping in and having a chat to us. So Bill is the head of technology and data risk at Cbus Super. And I've been scanning Bill's journey. Bill started in the army and then went into private industry, has worked at some of the major companies that we would all know, and is now at Cbus Super. But Bill, to get us started, just tell us a little bit about Bill Rue.
Okay, very quickly. I was born in Darwin. I was lucky enough to go through Cyclone Tracy, for those of you who might remember that. I currently live outside of Melbourne in the country on the southeast, so the equivalent of living in the Blue Mountains here in Sydney. My wife thinks that I'll go to Tasmania, Antarctica, and probably come back up through China at some point.
Cool. All right, excellent, thank you. All right, Bill, so to get us kicked off, can you sort of talk us about the journey that we're going through where we're sort of focusing on application security, but broadening that out now to data security? What's the difference and what's the journey?
Yeah, I think traditionally we've looked at, and we've been very good at technology, right? So we've looked at what that technology looks like and how we focus on that. We know how to build things, we know how the code works, we know how everything goes through that. But the analogy I use with the teams is, and I'll use a vendor name, not open text, but let's say you use a CRM, whether that be Oracle or Salesforce. I don't really care what that is until you put our data inside it. So at that point, it becomes interesting. So now how do we actually secure what that is and how the people actually use that? So in terms of getting and we talked, and where's Michael? He's floating around. In terms of SaaS, DAST and SCA, very important, making sure that that's all there because that's helping protect the way that applications work with handling the data or giving it to the people who use it. But how do the people actually know what to do with it? Where's it come from? Where's the lineage? And then what are they going to do right through the life cycle through to disposal?
Cool, all right. So we started talking about that data, and personal information is a big thing at the moment. In the news in the last couple of years, we've seen many breaches and what that means. What are some of the specific issues around data in the super industry and how are you sort of looking to manage that?
Yeah, there's a couple of different ways that we look at superannuation data. So our members are very critical, funnily enough, and a lot of organisations have some type of personal information, personally identifiable information. The Act itself doesn't necessarily make it easy because it's a combination of things. It's a piece of this, it's a piece of that, and it's a piece of this. The way I look at it is, what is that combination, either on its own or when combined with something else that you have access to, could be used to cause harm? So as in terms of an outlier. So that's from a PII perspective. What I do find is parts of my organisation focus on the PII, but they forget about confidential data. So we obviously we're trying to create a financially stable future for people in retirement. Part of that means that we run our own investments. So whether we work with partners or do our own. So it's not only PII, but it's also confidential data. So what do we do? And some of that might not be confidential for long, it might be time sensitive. So it might be only confidential for a period of time. An example I typically talk about are things called crediting rates. Crediting rates before they're published, they end up on the public website, before they're published are highly confidential because that's about what we're doing. Once we publish them, you could talk about it down the pub. So it's important to think about the different styles of information and how that information could be used and how that information is part of that life cycle. So when we think about, I often talk about production systems and non-production systems with developers. I have a personal view that the non-production system that a developer uses is actually a production system. It just happens to be that they're doing their code in there, right? Still one of our production systems. What I like to talk about is higher environments and lower environments. Lower environments have less data, has less controls, because that data shouldn't matter. Production data, that's the data that we want to protect. They're the things that we want to have the controls over, and the education that goes with it.
Okay, that's quite an interesting point because, fairly easy to put technology in, it's fairly easy to define policies, but how do you actually bring the wider organisation on the journey that you're talking about? What are some of the resistance you get when you're trying to put those security processes and policies and technology in place from your organisation?
Yeah, no, it's great. I actually on the way up here, I'm from Melbourne, so on the flight up, I saw one of those memes that come through, and I loved it because it said, one of the things we like to whinge about is we hate change, but we also don't want to stay the same. Okay, so how do we actually deal with that dichotomy? How do we deal with that tension? The big thing for us is how do we educate our people, and it's my favourite radio station, WII-FM, W-I-I-F-M, what's in it for me? If we don't understand what it is for the person who's actually going to be going through this, how are they going to buy into why it's important? For us, it's relatively simple. We're very member focused. It's one of our key attributes that we look at. And we say to our people, okay, this is why it's important, but have relevant examples for them in their context. I don't use the same example that I use for the chairman of the board that I might use for someone who's working on the front counter, and a different one that I might be using for an investment analyst. So making sure that it makes sense to them why that's important.
Okay. And what about, historically speaking, when I used to do coding, security was just a gate to get through when you needed to get to production. How have you integrated it across all the different silos or all right across the organisation? So, security is top of mind.
Yeah, so in terms of starting with security first, how do we actually make sure, and I love the title earlier, how do we shift further left? Okay, we've been shifting left slowly but surely, but how do we shift further left? How do we give it to the people who are working on things so they get that information in near real time? I always say near real time because there's always something there, right? So in terms of understanding what that is. If we can get that to them so they can make those changes, there's no real big bang, there's no real pressure of the day to get released to say, okay, well, we're doing the final scan, oh no, we found something. How do we make sure that that happens along the way? The other element is still that stage gate. So how do you build that into your ITIL processes, if you're ITIL shop, your agile processes, your ITSM processes, so you've still got those relevant gates and who can sign those off. And in an important part of that whole process is understanding who is the data owner, the data custodian who's helping the data owner, because the data owner might not understand the technology, but the data custodian should know how it works. And if they don't understand what that risk actually means, how could they accept it or reject it to go back through that pipeline?
Okay. And, when we're looking at data, it's just not around the privacy as well. It's how do we catalogue it, how we manage documents, all those type of things. What certain areas are you looking at inside Cbus around how you manage the data, just not from a privacy point of view?
Yes. So from a privacy point of view, we've gone through a bit of an evolution. I've heard a few people talk about Purview, other systems that work with that, including the ECM tooling in terms of labelling and how that all works. For us, it's about how do we educate our people in a way that makes sense. So don't turn it on with something heavy on the day one. How do you actually start with something that makes sense, going back to what's in it for me? And how do you actually choose those things in the context that they use it? So for us, we use something relatively simple. Public is public, confidential is confidential, highly confidential is obviously highly confidential. Depending on your context, you might use different labels, but making sure that they understand that. What we also need to do is part of that observability, monitoring what that means. It's great that you put labels on it, but so what? What are you going to do with it? Why is it important? So are you now putting a restriction on what people can do with that? Are you actually running some rules over the top of that? What are the policies that work with that? And making sure that you close the loop and go back to them where appropriate and educate them in a positive way to say, what we've noticed is you seem to have put everything as public. Is that because you're trying to email it out to somebody when it really shouldn't? Or is it because you don't understand what the classification should be?
Definitely, okay. So just thinking about the future, obviously the risk profile is ever changing. We've seen a whole lot of technologies just in this room now, earlier this morning. So what's your future vision look like, leveraging some of these types of technologies to, further enhance your security profile for Cbus?
One of the key things for me is understanding, and part of it's a little bit around that discoverability. So it's really good, and technologists are good at looking at technology-based solutions. But how do we identify where people are using the data? A good example of this might be around model management. If you're familiar with models and how people build those, how do we actually understand how many people are accessing, for example, an Excel spreadsheet, and how often are they accessing an Excel spreadsheet? Might be an indicator to say, what are they using that spreadsheet for? Are they using it to inform some analytics, or are they using it to make decisions? And that might drive a different conversation to say, how do we actually take that to a different type of system? Should it stay in Excel? And we're all familiar with the pros and cons of that. Or should we now be looking at building that into a more robust system which has got better controls and more processes around it to help those decisions being made? What do I mean by that? If we're making decisions that are impacting our members, we have to be acting in our members' best interest. How are we doing that? How are we making the right investments at the right time? How are we actually helping them make sure if they're making a contribution, that those contributions are coming through? If they've got inquiries, what's the workflow of those inquiries? What is the data lineage of the information? We work with a number of different partners, and it might be that it starts in one system here, goes over here, goes through a number of different funnels, ends up in a CRM, and then goes to something like a Power BI report or a Tableau report. How do we know the quality of that data is actually accurate? How do we know the quality of that data is actually consistent? And if it's not, where in that lineage did the problem get introduced? And that's where the next evolution is. How do we actually get involved with that? And that's from a structured perspective. Then there's the whole unstructured data side of things. We've got control data. So I'll use the CRM example again. It's in the CRM, it's controlled. I run a report. I download that to a CSV file or to an Excel spreadsheet. It's now on my C drive or on a share somewhere, uncontrolled, unless you've got access control around that. But I now grab that and I email that to you. You're on the outside, okay, how do we capture that? How do we work with that? Similarly, how do we, if we're sharing it internally, how do we know where those copies are and which ones are the right and which ones have got the right ownership?
Okay. Right, well that's great insight, Bill, for all that. So just think, an Australian company, they're starting to think about, how they're going to secure their data. What would be those first steps that they should be looking at?
I'd be looking at what is the data. Going back to that where I started. Okay, if you've got structured systems, that's an easy place to start. But what happens with the data that's in that structured system? If someone, and let's say it's your front counter or you've got a contact centre and they're using that data, are they actually accessing it and only updating it in there? Or do they have to pull that out of there and do something else with it? Why do they need to massage it? Where does it go next? Then I'd work the other way. If it's in that structured system, how did it get there? How did it actually get into the system? And have you applied the right rules and policies to ensure that the right levels of access are around that? When you get into unstructured, you need to think about all of the different ways that communication can happen. It might be as simple as, okay, there's a number of different tools that you've got, but should you be allowing WhatsApp? Should you be allowing Teams? Should you be allowing Slack? What are the different styles that come through? Email, I'd like to say that, a few decades ago, we weren't going to use email anymore, but here we are. Right? So what are we doing around that? And then the other thing to consider isn't just what you're doing from your operational data stores, what are you doing today, but where else could they exist? How many people here have considered if their data retention policies, in particular around disposal? And if you've got a disposal policy, and let's say, I think the ATO is saying you keep your tax records for 7 years personally, yeah? But what happens if your backup policy says you keep your backup for 15 years? So what are you doing with that? Because holding data for longer can be as equal a risk as holding it on the system itself. But then if you are considering backups, have you actually maintained the systems to be able to read those?
Cool. All right. Great. That was great insight, Bill. Thank you for your time. I'm assuming you're sticking around, so if anyone's got some questions after the session, I'm sure Bill would be happy to have a chat as well. But thank you very much.
No problem.